thoughts, questions on anything we've talked about over the last day and a half here? Back there, yes? Okay, awesome.
Let me help you with that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for the very interesting and inspiring presentation.
Thank you.
My question is,
Oh, there. Okay, gotcha.
how do you balance humor? How much humor is too much, or is too little, and what should be the nature of humor so that you can be able to respect the different age range, I mean people with different age, and when not to be humorous, or how to really play with it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a 1-hour seminar I've done on just that topic of humor. I'm a huge believer in the positive effect of humor in communicating in sermons. There are a number of compelling studies that suggest humor is one of the best ways that we connect with people, that we feel together, that people remember. Remember what you preached in the sermon. A lot of times, if you were to ask people the next day, well, what do you remember about the pastor's sermon? If they remember anything, a lot of times they will say, oh, I remember that story he told about, and it was likely a funny part of the sermon. Or one of my favorite sources of humor is just stuff that happens impromptu, and so like if all the lights go out, or if something happens that is just funny, we remember that, and it makes deeper trenches in our brains, so that because it's connected with with emotion. Like, so I'm just thinking, this was a couple of years ago now. The children's story. My friend Victor told the children's story, and he talked about a birthday, I think, and he had a cake up there as a prop, and then after the second service, when he didn't eat the cake anymore, he asked, are any of you kids celebrating a birthday? And sure enough, there was a kid who was having a birthday that day, so it was her birthday, and so Victor said, here, well, I'll give you a birthday cake. So that was a cool, memorable children's story or whatever. Well, in the middle of my sermon, and this is one of those impromptu moments that is memorable and was so fun and funny, in the middle of my sermon, I feel this tug on my suit. And I looked down, and only then, I don't know how she got up there, but it's that girl, it's the birthday girl, tugging on my suit. So, oh, hi. What do you need? Or what are you doing up here? Or whatever. She just caught me by surprise. And she says to me, I need a fork. And I thought that was so wonderful. I'm like, yeah, who would give you a birthday cake without a fork? And I said, yeah, and so we get her a fork. Well, it was one of those spontaneous moments that, of course, the congregation just busted up laughing. Another one that comes to mind is that I'm kind of free rambling here in my memory is one of our associate pastors, the youth pastor, told a children's story, and he balanced this 2x4 that didn't look like it would hold him up. In first service, it went without a glitch. It was awesome, and you know, he stood on this 2x4 and he talked about how we can trust God. You may not think you can, but you can. Just look at this arrangement. Well, second service, just as he's getting ready to make his point, you can trust God. He's like this board. It broke, and he just fell on his face, and everybody was shocked. And so you ask people, what's the most memorable moment at the Kettering Church? A lot of times people, if they were there that week, they'll remember. And humor does that. He was okay, so it was funny. It wasn't, he didn't break his back or anything. That wouldn't have been funny. But, so, I'm a big believer in humor. There are a lot of, if you study humor, what makes us laugh? What's funny? Well, it's different things. One can be exaggeration. One can be a surprise anywhere you didn't see it coming. Another can be like you as a listener know, and so you feel superior, and we laugh at that because I've given examples of all these from sermons that the audience knows, but the person in the story doesn't know, and that makes us laugh. There's lots of ways that you can think about humor. I would say, I always try to I try to use appropriate humor, but it can go too far. And if it's just humor for itself, I think that's where you kind of cross the line, that you're not a stand-up comic. People have said to me, well, if the preacher thing doesn't work out, you could be a stand-up comic. Well, I don't think that's really a compliment, because we're not entertainers. We are communicators of God's Word. So I think that if it becomes about you or about the humor, rather than about connecting on a human level, because life is funny and we enjoy laughing, and it does produce endorphins and healthy things inside of us when we laugh together. And so I am a big believer in using humor, but hopefully always in an appropriate way. And certainly I can give you examples where humor has backfired, or I haven't used it appropriately, and that's not good. But I think prayerful and intentional is good. Or if it's not intentional and it's just spontaneous, I love those moments. That was the whole kind of premise of the improv church, that we would use impromptu moments and deal with some just kind of split funny things that happen at the improv church. So great question, and yeah, we could talk about it for a long time. Yes?
Thank you for the lecture. One of the commandments says, thou shalt be you.
Yes.
And we know that some people talk fast and some slow.
Yes.
How do we reconcile this with the number of words that a preacher needs to aim at? Because
what was that? I think I missed your question. I was with you right up to some preachers, some people talk fast, some people talk slow.
yes,
So I had my coach telling me I needed to talk faster.
Okay.
But that might not be, my style. Is that kind of what you're saying, or?
Yeah, because you mentioned that maybe an average listener could listen to maybe 600 words per minute or something like that. And then now you have someone who talks slowly, a preacher. How do we reconcile? I guess maybe one of the answers would be to practice and practice. Are there other things?
Well, but I think it's a great insight, and thank you for bringing that up. But I do think that the thou shalt be you trumps specific style. You want to, and so I'll give you an example. We were talking here not long ago about, you look at unique preachers. One of my favorite preachers, as I mentioned, is Maury Bennett. And I remember the last time he spoke at a workers' meeting, he talked for over an hour, his sermon was. He was very monotone. He has a beautiful baritone voice, and so he's easy to listen to, but he spoke really slow, like probably 50 words a minute rather than 500. He spoke really slow. He just stood at a podium. He didn't move at all. And I'm telling you, the place was absolutely riveted. I mean, it was just, and I looked around to see how everybody was just hanging on his every word. And so that's a bigger point than whether or not you use notes or whether or not you speak 500 words a minute or 100. Are you communicating effectively the Word of God? And in that case, he was. And that just works for him. And so I think that's the commandment. Thou shalt be you. You've got to, preach in your skin and in your style. And it's got to naturally, authentically be you. And if you don't tend to speak quickly, I don't think that's the end all of whether or not it was a good sermon or no. The end all is our lives being changed. Is God doing His work in us? Are we growing to be more like Jesus? Are we falling in love with Jesus? Are we people of grace? And so that's the win. I think a lot of these things are helpful to think about. And I think in my case, Dr. Dickinson is right, that it works better when I get my words speed up, that it connects better, that people don't tend to waver as much in their thoughts or whatever. So I think most important, because I think you're pointing out that they kind of can conflict or whatever, and all this stuff that we're thinking about. And so I think it's important to keep the big picture in mind. And in this case, I think thou shalt be you. God didn't call me to be Dwight Nelson. He didn't call me to be Doug Batchelor. He called me to be Carl Hammond. And so a lot of times when I come to places like this, I feel really intimidated and think, oh man, how can I be more like Doug Batchelor or whatever? And then I just remind myself, no, I'm going to try to express myself as authentically and truthfully as I can, and just God, you use me. So if that's to speed up my words when I speak, okay, if that can make me more effective, then good. But the big thing there is just to be you, and then to work on dress and word pace and pausing and all of this stuff. It's not a formula. It's not prescriptive. It's hopefully helpful suggestions to think about, experiment with, and hopefully it makes you a better communicator. So, does that make sense? Oh, way over here, yes. You have a beautiful smile. She is one of the people I continually keep looking at because she gives me love when I look in that direction.
Thank you for your own presentation.
Thank you for being here.
I like to make clarify for myself. What is the difference between the parables and the illustrations? Could you explain to us clearly?
Yeah, I think parables denote a specific, thing in my thinking, and there might be different definitions, but my initial response to that would be a parable I think of as the story that Jesus told. And so I kind of put the stories that Jesus told as parables that's the nomenclature, that's the language we use to describe that. They are, in effect, illustrations as well. So to me, illustrations is much broader because you can illustrate with something other than a story, where I think of a parable as a story that illustrates, and I think of an illustration as anything that illuminates what you're trying to teach. And that might be an analogy, it might be something other than a story per se.
Okay, then my next question is, do we say Jesus also used the illustration for, during his sermon?
Mm-hmm.
We say he used.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
Usually we say he used the parables, right?
Right.
Yes, then we don't say he's using the illustrations.
Yeah, you're right, but when he made statements like, you are the light of the world, that's not so much a parable or a story as it is an illustration, illustrating. He's using a metaphor to link, that you are a light in a dark world. So and whether or not, maybe you can add, I've got esteemed professors in our midst that really know more about this than I do, I'm sure.
What I'm asking you about is, usually we a little bit argue with my husband, okay? After his preaching, I'm just telling him, because he's never used illustrations, okay? He's never using the illustrations in his sermon. From the beginning to the end, he's just, using all scriptures. Then sometimes I just give him a little bit, why don't you use a little bit, just one or two, making more, smooth or some more communicative, kind of the tip I give him, and he say always to me, remember you use some kind of the old stories or the things, make it clear. That's what Jesus preaches. So I cannot say anything. I know Jesus, the preacher was a little bit different from yours, and we are a little bit. So I like to clarify my idea and his idea is really different. I don't know. I cannot say which one is better, but I want to know. We should use illustrations in our the sermon. Since we learn this, you taught us we have to use kind of,
Yeah.
But some people, they don't like to use.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what?
Well, and I think going back to, you have to be authentic. And so, and again, I don't want any of this to feel prescriptive. There's only one right way to do it, and that's to use 4 illustrations per sermon and 1 parable, because that's what Jesus did for whatever. I don't think it's a formula. I think it's very organic and dynamic, and the Holy Spirit is at work. And I think we've all probably had the experience of feeling like that was definitely the worst sermon ever preached on the planet, and then somebody contacting you a year later and saying, that was the sermon that changed my life, or a week later, So I think there's a lot of fluidity, and so it's not. I would never say you have to use illustration. For some people, if they're effectively, inspiring life change and connecting people with God, and the sermons do that, then I would never be one to suggest, well, no, that doesn't work because you're not using enough illustrations. But that said, my own personal style is I use a lot of parables and illustrations and stories, and when people would maybe suggest to me you use too many stories, then I go straight to Christ and say, well, just look at how Jesus preached. He used them. So I think it's good to use them, but if your husband doesn't want to, then I don't want to get in the middle of that. Thank you. Yeah, wonderful. Please. Oh, do we have the mic? Back here, okay, and then we'll come down here. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for your lecture.
Oh, thank you.
In some areas, you could receive invitations from the Sunday churches to come and preach in their church. I'm just trying to seek opinion here because certainly when they ask you to come and preach, they're really not saying come and convert us into Adventism. What message? But at the same time, you feel kind of have some obligation to touch on areas like the Sabbath and so forth. What precautions would you suggest for such an arrangement?
Yeah, that does create a tension, doesn't it? I worked when I was in the seminary as the youth pastor of a Church of Christ, which was more conservative in many respects than Adventist churches. For example, they didn't use any, piano or music, and it did create issues. For example, they were having a weekend ski trip on Sabbath, and they wanted me to go with the youth group, and I just said, oh, that's my Sabbath day, and they were fine with that. So, I think as you genuinely get to know people and kind of do life together with people, it builds a mutual trust and respect that we can, but yeah, I do think you're right when you say we need to be careful not to sort of cram our own, convictions in setting and context. I think is everything. That if they invite me to speak on Sunday morning in their church service, and they ask me to preach in a series that they're on the Sermon on the Mount, and I use that opportunity to talk about the Fourth Commandment, then I think that violates trust. But I also live in a community, and I'm very grateful for this, that we have 10 hospitals right in our close vicinity, 10 hospitals, and then hundreds of ERs and standalone clinics and so on. And so the Kettering Health Network, and we're on the campus of headquarters, our church is, we have very good relationships with the Sunday churches and with the community through the hospitals. And so I do think that's a sacred trust zone. We have to be very sensitive to, if the timing is right and the Spirit is clearly, calling us to, and if they're asking questions about whatever, Sabbath or State of the Day, whatever doctrine we believe in, and I think, it's certainly appropriate. You never want to abuse the pulpit, though, from somebody who entrusts that sacred calling to you in their church and violate, what. So I always try to, whether it's an Adventist or non-Adventist church, I always try to be really sensitive to what the local church, needs or what they want me to talk about, preach about, and just honor that. So. Yes?
Thank you. I am the visitor from Korea. I was staying, one of my friends asked me to attend to this meeting, this seminar, so I attended all. I received lots of questions. Also, I was greatly inspired. Thank you for your great lectures.
Thank you. Very kind.
My question is this, concerning the time of sermon, especially the Friday evening. We have in Korea we have two meetings in the evening, Tuesday evening and Friday evening. Of course, Saturday we have divine worship. When I was young, usually the speaker spoke more than 1 hour, but not tedious, not boring. Recently, there is a great trend, tendency, getting short. The time of sermons are getting shorter and shorter. And they say shorter is better. So even my own church, there are around 80 adults in my own church. Even my pastors, pastor and intern pastor, they teach, they spoke very around 20 minutes, sometimes 17 minutes. Church starts from 7:30 to 8:30 until 8:30, 1 hour. Even not fulfilling that time. Only sometimes they finish all the sermons around 8:10, starting 7:30, 8:10, including songs and prayers for hours. So sometimes I suggest, I told, I advised my pastors, please fulfill or speak up to the 8:30. So my question to you is, what is ideal time, and most ideal time for the evening meeting? When I was asked to speak, I usually speak from 40 to 45 minutes, up to 8:30.
Yeah.
If chance is given to me, I rather speak overtime rather than shorter.
Yeah. It's
recently,
much easier to.
Yeah, but recently, not only my own church, almost many churches, getting shorter and shorter. So,
Yeah.
so I really worry about that.
Yeah. Well,
We have a great message to preach,
Yeah.
Even the 40 minutes is shorter, but listen to the pastors speak only 20 or 30, and most 30 minutes together. You will not fulfill the 8:30, not up to the 8:30. That's my.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I think a lot of that is just the culture and the world we live in, that attention spans are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And so, the length of the sermon, we don't do a Friday evening service. If we do a Vespers, then we probably allot ample time for the sermon. But we do two services at Kettering. The first is a contemporary service. The second is a much more traditional, classic music kind of service. And first service, we meet from 10 to 11. And then Sabbath schools start at 11. So we've got virtually no time for people to get out and go to Sabbath school. And then we have two worship planning teams that plan the respective services. And it strikes me that typically when we critique the service from last week at first service, really the primary criteria we use is, did we get out on time? And if I go over 25 minutes in my sermon, that renders it a bad sermon. And that's kind of the standard by which we judge it. So how did it go? And I've share this with, and then second service, I will add sometimes an extra story here and there, and I did last Sabbath. I said, we're not in any big hurry here, and so I find a lot more freedom in the second service, even though it starts at noon, and so you can't go too late, but there's not that rigid deadline that you've got to be done, and if you're not, then you just kind of write off the whole service like it wasn't good. And so I was sharing with the planning teams that that's somewhat frustrating to me because, for example, when I was mentioning yesterday about the gratitude journal and the app, and I said, when we critiqued that service on Thanksgiving, it was, well, you went over 4 minutes, and that just creates a lot of problems, and it was 29 minutes, it wasn't 25, and a good time, and so on. But then it struck me that all of the people who said to me, hey, I'm using the Happy app, or the Happy feed, they were all from second service. And I was thinking, okay, that's what a win looks like. That's the win. We want people actually living differently as a result of our gathering. And if your only criteria is, does it get out on time, or is it a 25-minute sermon, or a 40-minute sermon, whatever, then I can do that. But that's not that's not the point. The point is not to get out on time, even though we try, and we usually do. Or to preach a 25-minute sermon. The point is life change. The point is growing to be more like Jesus. And so, so yeah, the whole time is a great question, and it is kind of a frustration to me that we are so driven by the almighty minute hand that I think it can take away from the point. Any others? If not, back here, last one. Here we go.
That's my last question.
Okay.
I wanted to know, is it normal to feel defeated? Let's say after you finish a sermon, you feel like you have not made the point. You just feel awful about yourself, and you think, I think I did not hit the nail on its head. And is that a normal feeling, or is that maybe you have other problems?
No, yeah, I've certainly been there and done that, and then that gets back to what I was saying, that I just find that I'm not a good judge of the life change that happens as a result, because that's the work of the Spirit working on people. And so I try, and I think I talk about it better than I actually do it, but I try to kind of remove myself from the sermons, both good and bad. When people are roaring or really responding, or you just feel like, man, this is working well, to not get too excited about that, because that doesn't mean that people are going to live differently necessarily. It might. And then on weeks where I just muff it up big time, and I feel very discouraged and defeated, and then people can say things, pastors, that are really discouraging, and not take that personally. I will say though that what my wife rarely comments a lot one way or the other, but a comment from my wife, an observation, what she says to me is worth about 100 comments of what others say. So, if a lot of people just say that was a terrible sermon, after a while, I remember coming out of a camp meeting in Florida, this is years ago, and the guy hands me a note, and I just said, thank you. and he scowls, you know, he's sour face, he scowls, he says, you might want to read that before you say thank you. And sure enough, it was a very, you know, nasty letter about my sermon and my theology or whatever. And, you know, after 30 plus years of doing this week after week after week, it just kind of does sort of tame down both extremes. The negatives, yeah, I don't like them, but, you know, or the positives. You know, at the end of the day, it's the Spirit of God at work. It's His work, and, you know, I just try to be faithful. But now if my wife says, you know, this came across like that, or I really like this one, then that's like exponentially more. I really listen to what she says. But the rest of it, you know, I think you just have to sort of deal with, you know, I sort of have a framework in my mind on dealing with critics that, you know, I always listen to, I always read anonymous letters, learn what I can, and then I just leave it to God, and so I just kind of negative comments. I don't know. But it's part of being a pastor, isn't it? And it's like sermons are like children, you know, and you're very attached to them, and you spent so much time putting it together. I remember not too long ago, a woman came out and she said to me, why do you waste our time with silly stories about the Boston Red Sox? We don't care. Why can't you just give us meat? You know, and I sort of debriefed that comment, and it stung. I can't lie. And I, debriefing with my wife, I said, you know, it's what's hurtful is I know I spent 25 hours writing and preparing that sermon. And then, the truth be told, for her anyway, if I just stood up there with 30 seconds of cutting and pasting Ellen White quotes and just reading a bunch of Ellen White quotes, she would have been more fed, and that's frustrating to me. That, you know, I'm really trying hard to, you know, so the comments can hurt, and I think, again, we just have to be faithful and let God, you know, convict us as He will, and we just keep trying this. A few thoughts in closing, and then we're done with this. It's been a great time. Thank you all for being here, and I was so appreciative of the invitation and the epic Filipino hospitality. It's like nowhere in the world, so thank you.